class. I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture introduces us to the subject of metaethics. This week we'll look at the cognitive and realist debates regarding the nature of moral truth and moral properties. And the lecture is divided into two segments. The first segment this week focuses on cognitive theories, but introduces key terms and positions for both cognitive and non-cognitive theories, as well as realist and anti-realist positions. So these are two different subjects in metaethics: the question of meaning, the meaning of moral statements, and that's the cognitive versus non-cognitive debate, and then the question of truth, the truth of moral statements, and that's the realist versus anti-realist debate. Okay. So the lecture begins with discussion by Dimmock and Fisher. So please, when you can, read Dimmock and Fisher 2017, pages 93 to 119 as background to the lecture. And I present a taxonomy of the important positions and offer key definitions. So visually, it will help to look at the written lecture this week to put things into place easier and to reflect back on that at times when you do the readings and you complete the activities, so you can work with things easier. It can help as a nice visual aid. So let's look first then at cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. So this is the question about the meaning of moral statements. What do moral statements mean? Okay. The first position is called cognitivism. Okay, the first position at which we'll look. This is a theory about the meaning or semantic value of moral terms, right, wrong, and the psychology behind moral statements. So you can think of it as encompassing a semantic and a psychological component. And the two, the semantics and the psychology, are usually taken together and typify what we call the common sense view. All right. So moving then from cognitivism, we can look then at the semantic cognitivism and the psychological cognitivism, define those individually. And then remember, both together constitute what we call the more common sense position to take. Okay, regarding the meaning of moral statements. So for semantic cognitivism, you can define it in the following way. Moral statements can be true or false. For example, murder is wrong. The statement murder is wrong. It can be true or false. It makes a claim that can be true or false. The statements aim then to pick out a moral aspect of the world. Moral language is descriptive in attempting to describe moral features of the world. Descriptions are true when accurate and false otherwise. So this theory presupposes then something like a correspondence theory of truth, but does not say whether moral statements are in fact true. That's the question of the realism versus anti-realism debate. That's the question raised in the realism versus anti-realism debate. You can have a meaningful statement that's true or false, right? Sherlock Holmes is a detective. Well, it's true in a sense, but there is no real Sherlock Holmes. He's a fictional character. So the statement's meaningful, but not literally true. Or you might say, Biden is the president. Well, that's literally true, right? The president of the U.S. So we can have a literally true statement that's meaningful. We can have a literally false statement that's still meaningful. right? So the question of meaning is separate from the truth question then. On this position, moral statements are meaningful in that they appear then to present truth claims that may or may not, in fact, be accurate. Okay. Notice how this position, semantic cognitivism, characterizes semantic description, moral descriptions as descriptive. Okay, that's a contrast to what Hume had said earlier in the course when we looked at Hume's position on the is-ought problem. If you recall, Hume said there were statements of fact and descriptive claims, and then separate there were statements of value, and these were non-descriptive claims. Well, this position says no, statements of value and moral statements can be descriptive. You see this disagreement with Hume right from the start then here. So semantic cognitivism will begin with a sharp disagreement with Hume's emotivism, and we'll look more at Hume's position in the lecture. So let's define psychological cognitivism now. This is the position that moral statements are expressions of beliefs in contrast to non-belief attitudes or psychological states. All right. For example, say just desires or wantings, that it could be more impulsive without any content toward which you're thinking maybe. You might desire something, but not be thinking any claim about whether it's true or false, right? You might desire a cup of coffee, but you might not be asking yourself, is coffee good or bad, or do I like this brand more than this brand, right? Statements or questions that raise statements that have truth values. Rather, they just might be more like emotional expressions. Okay, so psychological cognitivism then says that moral statements and moral judgments, more precisely, involve belief states of the subject, okay? We're not just sharing joy or anger or expressing emotion or desires. We're making judgments about what's true or false, okay? So together, again, semantic and psychological cognitivism make up what Dimmock and Fisher label the common sense view. Okay. So let's look then at the contrast in this debate, non-cognitivism. This position says, as an opposing theory, that the meaning and psychology of moral statements is different from the standard view at which we just looked. Okay, and it also has two components: semantic non-cognitivism and psychological non-cognitivism. All right, and predictably, these will deny the claims of the cognitivists and offer a different take on things. Okay, so for semantic non-cognitivism, here the idea is that moral statements are not meant to describe the world, but only express our attitudes or feelings, say disgust or anger or pleasure, happiness. So the statements are not meant to be true or false. Okay. For psychological non-cognitivism, moral statements are not beliefs. They are just desires or preferences, emotions, or that kind of thing. So we have the contrast then between the cognitivist and the non-cognitivist. The cognitivist theory says that moral statements should be understood more like descriptive claims that could be true or false, theoretically, whereas the non-cognitivist says, no, they're not descriptive claims, they're just claims of emotion, and they're neither true nor false. Truth values don't apply to them. You see, so there's a sharp contrast there. So, having explained that debate, the parameters of that debate, let's set up then the positions, the terms, define terms, and set up the positions for the realism versus anti-realism debate. And that's the debate about the truth of moral statements, whether in fact any are true or not, right? So the first position here is called realism. And this is the view that moral properties exist in the world independently of human beings. Like other properties. Okay, so think of an action of Socrates possessing the property of being Socrates' action. Okay, or water in Lake Ontario. It has properties like temperature, depth, and wetness, etc. So realists think that there is a possibility for error then, insofar as we can inaccurately describe these moral properties. Okay, so belief does not make something wrong. Believing murder is wrong does not make it wrong. Rather, an actual objective or mind independent property in the world is needed to make the action right or wrong. Okay, so this contrasts then with the anti-realist position, and the anti-realist position says objective and mind independent moral properties do not exist. Okay, so moral properties are like dragons or leprechauns in mythology or in our imagination and in our fictions. Okay, this view usually tracks with non-cognitivism. Okay, we do not aim for truth in our moral statements because moral properties do not exist. So otherwise, why not try to describe them if we think they do exist, right? So moral error theory is the outlier here, and we'll look more at that theory too. So having explained the key positions on both the cognitivism and the realism debate, the cognitivism versus non-cognitivism, the realism versus anti-realism debates, we turn to contemporary theories where people put these issues into practice and try to work within the parameters, the framework there that we just laid out, and try to argue for a position to make sense of moral statements. Okay. So again, we build off of Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, and they offer some fresh interaction with some key issues. As a reminder, try to do the back reading there before completing the lecture. So, for example, they note more detailed discussion of the is-ought problem and naturalistic fallacy. Okay, and that can be helpful if you look at that in more detail. So, looking now at the meta-ethical positions, the first general position is called cognitive realism then. Okay, and there's going to be different versions of these different positions, and I'll integrate the theories about which we learned at key points in the presentation so you know how to classify those theories. Okay, and if you have questions, again, you can review the lecture but also use the written lecture as a guide, because the taxonomy there will be helpful visually to manage all the different positions. Okay, so in cognitive realism, one of the main positions is called moral naturalism. Okay, and this is the view that moral properties are natural properties rather than something non-natural, and they make our moral statements true or false. Okay, so by natural, most naturalists mean a property like that of science, say being wet for liquids, or magnetic, right, for magnets or something like that. So these properties are not supernatural, they're not commands of the gods, and they're not beyond the scope of science. So here we can cite Harman's work, but moral naturalists seek to explain moral truth naturally then, apart from appeal to God or to Platonic forms. Plato, again, thinking that there is a realm of eternal forms. Um, so some ethicists have identified, like Plato, the good with an eternal form. Okay, that's not God or a personal creator or God, but something unnatural the way people think of nature, right? It's not like a branch on a tree or something. So this view says, well, moral properties are not supernatural or something unnatural, but just natural properties. Okay, moral naturalism. And a version of this theory is the utilitarian theory at which we looked in the course. Recall utilitarianism was developed by Bentham and Mill, and in utilitarianism, quantities of pain and pleasure are what ground are in fact identical to moral properties. Natural properties like neural firings or psychological explanations of pain or pleasure make for the good or the bad. Okay, so moral properties are the experiences in the brain, or the events in the brain, and our experiences of pain and pleasure. Those, in fact, are the moral properties, and so that's why there's nothing non-natural. That's why we don't need anything non-natural beyond pain, suffering, or joy or pleasure, happiness. Okay, and those are just natural states, and so we can have a natural account of moral properties on this view. Another position for moral naturalism is virtue ethics. Philippa Foot and Hursthouse are advocates of virtue ethics, and we saw that virtue ethics focuses on uh, developing our characteristics, character traits, so that we flourish as human beings. And so those characteristics then, courage and such, are just natural characteristics, okay? Functioning well with an aim towards survival or reproduction, enjoyment, freedom from pain, and possession of a role in a group are natural. Another position here then for moral naturalism could also be thought of, could also be uh, a good category for natural law theory. So natural law theory looks like it has versions of moral naturalism, at least we can say that there were some theistic versions, but there were also non-theistic versions, right, where the good or the right is grounded in actions most conducive to human survival. So you might think that natural law theory could be classified here too, and perhaps even rights ethics. Okay, so you would have utilitarianism, virtue ethics, natural law, and rights ethics. Okay, so according to Harman, naturalism may lead to relativism, since natural properties can vary from time and place. But Kripke had argued again. I don't know if you recall if I mentioned this in lecture, but Saul Kripke had argued that we can contingently discover necessary truths. So, for example, water is made of H2O. It's necessary that water is made of H2O, that's its essence. If we had found some other atomic, if we had found that water was made of some other atomic composition, well, that just wouldn't be the water as we know it, but that would be something different, right? Twin water or something. But discovering whether or not water was made of H2O or some other composition was just a matter of contingency. We had to look and find out. So Kripke is saying, well, just because moral properties could be natural, well, the idea is that on Kripke's view, just because moral properties could be natural doesn't mean that they would be relative, right? Just like we can discover necessary truths, then the relativity of culture and place and time doesn't obstruct with discovering necessary truths. In this case, not of water, but of moral properties. So moral properties would necessarily then be the properties that they are. And it just wouldn't happen by chance to be those properties, okay? The concern that moral naturalism leads to relativism doesn't look very threatening for scientific realists like Saul Kripke, okay? Now, Moore raised some objections to moral naturalism. First, he said that the first one is the objection of simplicity. Moral properties are simple, like color properties, he says. Color properties cannot be explained in terms of other concepts or properties. So, for instance, we can explain what a horse is to someone, but we cannot explain what yellow is to somebody who has not seen it. So colors must be experienced. Similarly, moral properties cannot be defined by something else. They have to, that means they cannot be reduced to pleasure or pain or characteristics, because pleasure can be explained as a natural property like neurons firing, right? Characteristics can be explained. The objection then is that because moral properties are simple, they can't be explained the way other natural properties can be, so they can't be natural. That's what Moore's objection is saying at this point. But however, in response, if reductionists about color, reductionists can explain color as light waves trapped at various frequencies at the subatomic level. And so you might question the analogy with color then, right? Because color then isn't simple after all. So some non-reductive physicalists also think that pleasure involves some other type of phenomenal or occult quality, but are yet naturalists in some sense. Okay, so there are some views in philosophy of mind that think that the mind isn't anything supernatural or non-natural. It arises naturally, but there's still something mysterious about it, and we can't quite say what we can't easily identify all of its properties and settle the question to everyone's satisfaction. Just what is the mind on a naturalist ontology or as a naturalist? It's hard to explain the precise position of the mind in the natural order, but it could still be just a natural phenomenon or natural property. Okay, so if you're a reductionist or a non-reductive physicalist, you can still think that there could still be natural properties that could be moral properties, even if they're not like color or simple properties like abstract properties like Plato had thought, right? So you're going to make sense of just properties differently there, and you'll leave that open maybe, or look at that more and say, well, natural properties can be different than what maybe someone like Hume had thought, or even Plato had thought, and what Moore had thought, but they don't need to be Platonic or non-natural. They can still be mysterious, but they don't need to be given based on commands of the gods or Platonic forms. Again, they might not be supernatural or non-natural. They can be natural, even if there's some mystery there to how they emerged or their precise nature. Okay, so it's not clear that Moore's first objection from simplicity is a good one here against moral naturalism. Okay, but he does have another argument, and this one is called the open question argument and naturalistic fallacy. So even after we have all the facts about an event, say, we know all the natural properties, we can still ask the moral question, what is the right thing to do, or what should be done in this case? So the attempt to reduce moral properties to natural properties commits this naturalistic fallacy. Okay, and that's similar to Hume's argument, I think. But More argues, but More's argument actually works against non-natural reductions of goodness too. Okay, for instance, God's commands, or the commands of the gods, descriptions of how the Greek gods behaved, etc. Those leave open the question whether the commands or actions are good or not, right? Like in ancient Greece, the Greek gods would get up to all kinds of strange soap opera-like antics, right? And some of the gods would seduce women and have affairs, and were murderous, or would behave poorly. And so just um, giving a description of how supernatural beings behave or what they say doesn't tell us what is right or wrong, right? So you could raise More's problem here against even non-natural accounts of moral properties. So it looks like a problem that arises for moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism then, okay? So if good is simple, says More, it cannot be natural, but then it looks like it can't be non-natural either, okay? So on pain of Hume's non-cognitive anti-realism, then, moral properties must be either natural or non-natural. Those are the only kinds of properties there are, all right? So we should agree with More against Hume, I think, that we cannot impose a natural requirement on morality. But by the same token, we cannot impose a non-natural requirement either. So it looks like, based on the data that More had presented in his argument, and Hume with regard to the is-ought problem and the naturalistic fallacy, we should leave open whether moral properties are natural or non-natural in face of More's open question argument, right? So More again says that for any description we have, that doesn't tell us how to behave. Okay, well, that depends on the description at which we look. What if the description is suggestive of behavior? Well, I think it couldn't be. Examples from nature also abound, right? When we do observe in primatology, primate behavior, we do see primates care for their young. That does tell us something about normative behavior for us as primates. So depending on the example at which we look and the description at which we look, we might find ourselves in agreement or not with Hume and More's argument. And that just suggests that the argument itself isn't enough then to push back the possibility of moral naturalism. In the face of More's argument from simplicity and the open question argument, then it looks like the more reasonable or cautioned thing to do is to say, I withhold a judgment at this point. Moral properties may be non-natural, but they may be natural too. We haven't seen anything that tells us conclusively either way, or really answers that question either way yet. Okay. Like phenomenal qualities of the mind, then, joy and pain, moral properties may be irreducible. Again, think of the non-reductive physicalist that I'd mentioned. But even non-reductive physicalists can think of themselves as naturalists in some sense, because they do not need to invoke God or Platonic forms to explain the qualia, the mental states, the mental properties. Similarly, they won't do that. They won't enforce, theorize, postulate God or supernatural properties or non-natural properties to make sense of moral properties. Okay, so the question of moral naturalism remains a live option, I think, in response to More's arguments. Okay, Well, what about moral non-naturalism? Okay, this view, on this view, moral properties are fundamentally simple and non-natural properties. This is basically Moore's position. Okay, by non-natural, these properties are not discoverable through empirical means, such as our properties in the sciences. They're known through intuition. They are intuited via a moral sense, okay, some kind of faculty that we have that puts us in touch with them. All right. So the faculty of intuition plays an important role here in how moral properties are discovered, and this process does not involve reasoning, but something self-evident or immediate, like truths of arithmetic. Okay. Ross holds that these are prima facie, they're graded duties, and can be known at a glance or at face value. Okay. Now the classic position for the non-natural, moral non-naturalism is deontology. Remember Immanuel Kant's position, the duty-based theory in ethics that grounds duties in universal principles to which we all have access by this faculty of intuition. So moral properties are universal and intuited by the faculty of moral sense. They are part of the framework of the world, if you will. They're just kind of built into the world. Okay. So intuitionists respond to Moore's open question argument and naturalistic fallacy in holding that moral properties are simple and non-natural, open to apprehension through moral sense. So they don't feature in descriptions, so you don't get stuck in the description versus value distinction there. They're known directly. You don't have to give a description of something to know them, right? And they're not natural because they're simple. Okay, they're not made of parts. They're not discoverable empirically, but we still intuit them. We still come into contact with them. Okay, so it's a non-natural property then. Now, some objections against the moral non-naturalist position include the following. The first one is a concern with explaining moral disagreement. Why is there so much disagreement if moral truth is self-evident, right? Intuitionism predicts greater agreement, but Ross suggests that we need to develop our intuitive sense through maturation. All right, so maybe when we're younger or less familiar with morality, we are more prone to make mistakes. Like with many other fields, as we learn, we make more mistakes at the beginning than later. That's the idea. Okay, so Samuel Clarke suggests in some cases it's merely a matter of mistake or stupidity. That could be true too. Okay, and intuitionism has also developed in other areas with much promise. Intuitionistic logics, possible world semantics, even in psychology. One could also focus on areas of agreement. This is the response to relativism. If we just focus on disagreements, we ignore areas of agreements. Okay, so it looks like both arguments there cancel each other out. So then the problem of explaining moral disagreement, intuitionists can give, moral non-naturalists can give a response to that problem. Okay, but I think it's still worth thinking about. What about this other problem, cognitive anti-realism? Okay. Let me see here. I'm sorry. That will be the final objection. That will be the only objection at which we really look then for moral non-naturalism. Then, in fact, we'll turn to the next section in discussion of cognitive anti-realism. Okay, so this is the counterpart to cognitive realism. When we began to look then at theories of moral natural properties versus non-natural moral properties. Okay, so moving from that unit now on, we're going to look at cognitive anti-realism. Okay, sorry for the confusion there. So the first theory at which we'll look for cognitive anti-realism is called moral error theory. Mackey holds that moral statements are truth apt or aimed at truth, or we aim to be accurate in describing the world. Okay, but in fact, um, they fail to refer to anything real. Okay, so we're cognitivists. We mean to make a description of the world, and we mean for it to be accurate. Um, but in fact, we're just mistaken about that. There isn't anything that's actually there to which we refer. Okay, and so that's why they're systematically false. Moral statements are systematically false because they don't refer to anything. They don't have any ground of truth. Okay, so the prescriptions are systematically false, but we do mean to describe the world. So on this view, I think it makes more sense if you think of it as thinking that there are moral properties and then and just being mistaken about that. Okay, but it's harder to make sense of for someone who thinks like Mackey that there are in fact no moral properties. Then, if that's the case, why would you continue to mean to try to refer to them if they don't exist? That's like continuing to assume Sherlock Holmes is a real person when you know he's a fictional creation, right? Um, so that his position creates this kind of oddity for someone who is enlightened like him, who accepts that there are and realizes that there are no moral properties. Then why would they continue to refer to them as if they're there? But he offers support for his arguments in inventing right and wrong. One argument is agreement from relativity. The argument is that agreement in the sciences has emerged over many things, but there is still general disagreement in ethics. So one explanation is that the continued disagreement in ethics arises because there are no moral facts or properties in the world to settle the disagreements, and that's why they persist. Okay. Well, now there's some responses though to this cognitive anti-realist position, moral error theory. The first one is that, as we saw with a previous response, while there are areas of disagreement, there are areas of agreement, and there is such a thing as moral progress. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights shows how there can be general agreement in ethics internationally. And some matters raise significant doubts. So general agreement on some matters raises significant doubts about the argument from disagreement for relativism because it displays some form of progress, right? But it also raises then problems for just this idea, Mackey's argument for moral error theory based on disagreement. The second problem is that some ethical disagreements may be about related facts instead of ethical properties. Some disagreements may be about factual issues themselves and not the ethics. If we were clear on the facts, then maybe there would be more agreement in the ethics. The third problem is that factual disagreements do not disprove the existence of facts. People do disagree about factual matters, say the date of George Washington's death, but this does not mean there is no fact of the matter. So disagreement doesn't show that there are no moral properties either by itself. Okay, no more than it shows that there are no facts over which people might disagree, like the date of George Washington's death. Okay, another problem, the fourth one here, is that relativism presupposes truth. Ethical relativism does not deny the existence of moral properties or facts. Rather, it just holds that moral truths are merely relative to a culture. So the moral properties will probably be something more distinctive about the culture and the time and the place. But they're still there though. Okay, Mackey says on Mackey's moral error theory, he says there are none. So it's not enough to show that relativism could be a problem or is true to show that error theory is true. Okay. So Mackey does offer another argument though, and it's called the argument from queerness. And this is the view that moral properties are strange and that they are not like typical natural properties. They do not even appear to be typical non-natural properties either. So how does a description of either natural or non-natural facts move from how things are to how things should be? So this recalls Hume's Izzat problem again, and Mackey's answer is that we should eliminate moral facts altogether because it is simpler than positing the existence of these otherwise strange entities, moral properties, right? It is also easier to suppose that we do not have the faculties of moral intuition, okay, to access these properties. So he's thinking of of a more reductive account of, in psychology, of cognition, okay, but you can be a non-reductive physicalist too, right? And and we did consider that intuition does play a role in psychology today in some fields, and there are some books on the subject too. But Mackey's idea is, well, let's just be skeptical about this faculty, and if we don't have that, how can we access these moral properties then, right? So, and Mackey's answer is that we should just eliminate moral facts altogether because it's simpler to make sense of things without them. It's also easier to suppose that we don't have the access to them, and so uh, where he disagrees with Hume, he's using Hume's argument, but he disagrees with Hume on the question of cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. So they actually both agree then. Hume and Mackey both agree on the question of anti-realism. Mackey and Hume agree that there are no moral properties. Okay, where they disagree is on the question of cognitivism versus non-cognitivism. Mackey thinks that Mackey is a cognitivist. He thinks we are trying to describe accurately the world. Hume said, no, they're just moral statements are just expressions of emotion and such like things like that. They're not pro-attitudes. They don't have propositional content. They don't make a claim about the truth or falsity of the world or something, right? So that's where Hume and Mackey disagree. I think that's an interesting point to take into account because Hume is such a pervasive, influential philosopher, and his views continue to impact us today. His emotivism, though, isn't as common in ethics today. But Mackey does have a position that's really similar to Hume there. Okay, so they agree on the anti-realism of things, but they disagree about the cognitivism versus the non-cognitivism, about the meaning of moral statements. Okay, so there's some responses to Mackey's queerness argument. Okay, moral properties may be unique. This response holds that moral properties are unique, could be unique, and so there's no reason to doubt their existence, since there is no reason to think properties cannot be unique sometimes. Okay, so Mackey says these are such strange properties. They're not like any other natural properties with which we are more familiar, right? Again, weight or something like that. Extension, so, okay, hardness or whatever physical properties you might discover empirically. Well, again, as a non-reductive physicalist, you might think, well, qualia aren't reducible to just brain states, but we still can't get clear on just what they are. Maybe that's how moral properties are too, though, and so they could be unique or just strange or mysterious, and still be natural or non-natural, but the fact that they're unique or strange isn't a good reason to reject them. Other natural properties are like that already, that we all pretty much accept. Okay, so the second response is that Mackey's queerness argument is counterintuitive. Moral error theory is counterintuitive because it suggests that all moral statements are false systematically, but the reasonable conclusion would be to abandon all ethical language altogether, since we know that the statements are false, right? And that's just an extreme conclusion. This was the problem that I had mentioned earlier when looking at Mackey's position, that once you become enlightened or you think like Mackey, Why continue to play the word game, right? But so, and the heavy baggage there is that it looks like everyone should just come together and stop playing the game. That looks like the more natural outcome of his. So then you would lose that cognitivism, and you would just go to Hume. Okay, so he doesn't really give us a reason to not go to Hume's motivism, okay, to accept Hume's non-cognitive account. Okay, non-cognitivism. Okay, another objection is that Mackey's argument is an oversimplification. Mackey's use of the principle of simplicity is questionable. If we do not already accept moral error theory, then there's no reason to think his explanation is preferable, because it would be judged an oversimplification. Okay, yeah, I guess it could be simpler in a sense if there's fewer things in your ontology, in your bag of things that exist. Well, if you take out moral properties, I guess there's fewer things in there. But if that creates a problem elsewhere, then that is just an oversimplification, and so simplicity isn't an admirable quality or a sign of truth. All right. So not properly accounting for the perceived truth of moral statements is the problem. Oversimplification. Hence, its application, Mackey's argument, the queerness argument, is not determinative. Is not determinative in favor of moral error theory. Moreover, current work in psychology focuses on faculties, like Fodor's modularity of mind. So there is no reason to question moral faculties, the existence of moral faculties, if we have other types of faculties. So intuitions are held to be functions of faculties, and so long as we have them, we don't have to question beg. The idea that we have faculties that put us into contact with moral properties doesn't seem like question begging, because we recognize, even as physicalists or naturalists or materialists, that we have faculties that do function to put us into contact with some data. Okay, so say in mathematics. So there's no reason to think then that that the simplicity of Mackey's position is a sign of truth then, and that a strangeness of non-natural properties would constitute a good argument against their existence. Things can be strange, even natural things. So, okay, so we'll look at the last response, which is the dubious expectation from naturalism, and we'll end the lecture with this final response to Mackey's cognitive anti-realism. Okay, his moral error theory. As previously discussed, Hume's reasoning mistakenly assumes moral properties cannot be natural, and Moore shows they cannot be non-natural in the same reasoning. However, many otherwise natural properties are mysterious, and their emergence cannot be explained. Here read Moreland, Naturalism and the Ontological Status of Properties in Naturalism. Rather, they're taken for granted. Hence, many natural properties appear queer as well. This definition of natural eliminates too many properties, and not just moral ones, if Mackey's right. By example, property dualists, substance dualists, and non-reductive physicalists hold that qualia, again, experiences of emotion and pleasure and pain, internal experiences, are ineffable, indescribable, brute, simple, they're not reducible to anything else, and mysterious, because they are only had and known in the first person, and science is about third person descriptions. We can't give an accurate description of what it's like to be to experience pain, you have to experience the pain to know what pain is like, right? So if I see someone in pain and I ask you, what is that? What is pain? And you say, well, pain hurts. That is circular. That doesn't tell me what pain is because all I have is the same, all I see is the same behavior. Well, it's smarts, pain smarts. No matter what we say about it, we can't quite get to what pain is unless we experience it, okay? But many people still think pain is a natural phenomenon we can experience. So it looks like natural properties can be mysterious, right? Can be hard to describe or indescribable, okay? Can be simple, um, and so on. And so Mackey's understanding of naturalism and Hume's understanding of naturalism looks dubious. It looks obsolete, in fact. Okay, so any definition of pain presupposes what is to be defined again, and the same is true of other mental of qualia. Okay, other types of qualia, whether it's pain, pleasure, joy. So. We don't need to reject the existence of pain because it is queer and unique, so we don't have to reject the existence of moral properties because they might be strange or unique too, if that makes sense. Okay, so we looked at objections then to responses to Mackey's queerness argument, okay, for his moral error theory. All right, next week we're going to keep on the subject of metaethics, okay, and we'll look at other positions in the debate. We're leaving off on cognitive anti-realism, and we looked at Mackey's moral error theory here, okay. When we come back, next week we'll look at the alternatives: non-cognitive realism, non-cognitive anti-realism, okay? And we'll look at the positions and the responses there as well. And we'll close lecture with that. So if you have any questions about some of the material in the taxonomy for the cognitivism versus non-cognitivism debate, or the realism versus anti-realism debate, or where the ethical theories fall into place that we've studied in the course, feel free to send me an email or stop by office hours or ask a question in discussion forum. This is some weighty material, and that's why I waited till the end of the course. And there's a lot, and there's a couple rough spots with the lecture. So if you need any help, go to the written lecture. That should clear things up. And again, just reach out with questions, and I can help provide explanations as needed. Okay. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.